am the mountain. I am old. So old, the mind of man can only ache at trying to comprehend. Think of a year, man's tiniest measurement of time. Now of 100 years, a century. Faster now, 100 centuries, 500, 1,000 centuries. Faster, further back, 5,000 centuries, 10,000 centuries. Can you follow still? 250 times 10,000 centuries back. That is my age. Even so, there were two other mountains, each in their own time, which stood here before me, going back 1 billion years to make these highlands among the oldest on earth. My peak was folded slowly upwards from cataclysmic eruptions, intense heat, and violent pressures. How? Some say I was born when Africa bumped into my lands. I then rose 5, 10, 15,000 feet. I soared higher than the Rockies.
Embracing a square mile within the southern Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina in northern Haywood County is a mountain with extensive cliffs, vast adjacent wooded slopes, and grassy meadows down its backbone at Gillett Gap. Whether called Cedar Cliff or Ferguson Mountain, it provides from its wooded summit an awe-inspiring view of Haywood County. Its highest point is around 4,280 feet above sea level, with a vertical drop of 800 feet on its southern face. A hiker standing on top gets a planetary feeling from looking at entire fields, valleys, and surrounding mountains. Throughout the eons of years, wind, water, and ice have worn down and sculptured the mountain to its present contours, an unseen and unseen process. The weathered and time-worn rocks have carved many intriguing shapes. They offer the only shelter from the prevailing winds. Only the hardiest of mosses and lichens can survive on these rocks. These ancient lichens grow only 1/16 of an inch in 25 years. Running down from the mountain is a lacework of streams fed by springs in such numbers that several remain nameless, all flowing to the Pigeon River, which the mountain keeps a careful eye on as it winds ever onward through the distant Smokies. In the spring, there are carpets of wildflowers, from the first misty white blooms of the sarvis to the later profusion of white dogwood. There are hundreds of plants, including the lichens, mosses, shrubs, and trees. Among them are the rare shooting star, found in only a few places. In the summer, the forests are colored with every shade of green in the spectrum. The enormous variety of trees is the mountain's most prized possession. Among the more interesting are the stunted eastern red cedars hanging precariously onto the southern cliffs, and the rare Table Mountain pine found only at higher elevations, with their vicious arm cones with their stout curved spikes which often persist on the trees for many years. The warm days of summer invite you to lie back and watch the clouds. The fall of the year finds Ferguson Mountain dressed in red and yellow. Resembling a painting which an absent-minded painter has allowed one brilliant color to flow into another. Summer rains and mists are less, and over this dazzling display is an intensely blue autumn sky, ablaze at dusk with the most dramatic sunsets of the year. The trees then shed their leaves, and the grass becomes like spun gold in the wind. Winter provides rime with crystalline beauty and snow covering the landscape waist deep on top of the mountain.
But I am the mountain, and in the last fleeting centuries there appeared a new life upon my slopes. At first, their only possessions were an axe, a knife, a rifle, their wagon and horse. They sent word back to those left behind that they were hewing logs in the land of paradise.
Where only Indians had lived before, came the first men intent on shaping not a new Europe, but a new world, but found instead geography that shaped them. It required a special breed of persons to thrust their way into these rugged hills, establish homes in the lonely, hidden coves, build communities along unknown streams and rivers. Scots, who had lived in Northern Ireland for a short time until famine, freeze, and unfair farming and manufacturing laws drove them to seek new lands and opportunities, found a congenial terrain in the southern Appalachian Mountains where few and less hardy souls would contest their claims and traditions. They were hungry for land, jealous of freedom, ever ready to fight, strong in initiative. In a region of make do or do without, they did both. The first to arrive and stay within Cedar Cliff's shadow could indeed trace their bloodline from the mountains and glens of Scotland. They were of the clan Ferguson. Their matriarch was Annie Laurie, whose name still lives on.
Maxwell's
first settlers were Robin and Frances Love Ferguson and their firstborn children. They built their log house on Lower Rushfork Creek in the late 1700s. Their grave is on top of the hill overlooking the Crabtree Baptist Church, with Cedar Cliff in the distance. Beside their home was a sycamore tree, which still stands today beside the Joe Smart home.
On the dark blue history, and for Bonnie Annie Laurie, I'll lay me down and be.
The sycamore witnessed happy times and sad, as these children were reared to young men and women. As the children grew up, married, and started families of their own, more homes were added, as noted from the swaying heights of the tree's top. They moved to Riverside, which was even called Ferguson during these early days. Panther's Creek, or Painter Creek, as called by all true-blooded natives. Ironduff, which was named for another Scottish settler, Aaron Macduff, and further up Rushfork Creek. Interruptions came. Civil war was waging throughout the land. In time of war, the mountain men responded to the call to fight and serve their country well. It was estimated that Robin and Fanny Love Ferguson had as many as 25 grandsons to fight with the Confederacy, with over 10 dying in this terrible war. Though no battle was fought nearby, Federal renegades moved through the forest in search of horses and livestock. They failed to notice the sycamore tree swaying in the breeze and the fact that a 10-year-old boy had taken the horses to the top of Cedar Cliff for safety. This mighty sycamore tree stands today as a tribute to those first settlers. Robin and Fanny Love Ferguson came early and they endured. They helped shape the ways of life of all those who came after. Their attitudes and products, legends and realities that are considered particularly Appalachian today. John Palmer and John Vavruska, two students with the University of Tennessee, both natives of Haywood, were attracted to the mountains to find out more about what relationship existed between a person and the place he lived. Preparing a slideshow for the renaming of Cedar Cliff to Ferguson Mountain provided them with such an opportunity. So they struck out for the hills and met some interesting people.
First memories of a child was when I lived at the base of Cedar Cliff Mountain. There was a nice level spot there. My dad bought the mountain from his father, 130 acres up there. And he built a new house, and that was such a thrill to us to move up there. When I was a girl, we walked down to Riverside School. When we'd get up in the morning, it was bright and sunny where we lived. We could look down over the valley. It was covered with fog. And when we'd walk down to school, after about half the way, we'd go into the fog, and then it was real dense fog. And the fog would stay down there till about 10 o'clock, and that was just like living in a different world, because I'd got up in a bright sunny spot and come down into the fog.
Green Oak Road, overlooking the French Broad River near Asheville, we met the colorful Mrs. Walina Ferguson Jarvis. Raised in Ferguson Cove at the base of Cedar Cliff, near the last spring site up the hollow.
Another thing I want to tell you about, living up there next to that mountain is something that, unless you lived in a place like that, you just can't experience it. When it would thunder and lightning, the lightning would run right along the ground, right along the top of the mountain, and you'd be right close to it. And when it would, in a bright sunny day and white clouds roll up, back then my father called them thunderheads, but they'd just be so close to you, you'd feel like you was up on top of the mountain, you'd just reach the clouds. And then I remember eagles swooping down. The eagles are all gone now, but we saw eagles fly from the top of the mountain, and they'd come down, sail around, and then go back. And my family always hunted, and my dad always kept dogs. And he'd say, they'd all have names, and he could tell by the bark which dog it was. And he'd say, old Fan, she went out to the high tops, and then she'd take right after that fox, and they'd go right down into the dead levels. So one day they'd been up there fox hunting, and I was down at the house, and I looked up, and the fox was ahead of the hounds, a good little bit ahead of the hounds, and they was running right around through the face of the cedar tree. And the hounds were behind, strung out 8 or 10 hounds, every one of them barking. Papa said, listen to that music. Isn't that the prettiest music you ever heard?
Walina also recalled the days when she was a one-room school teacher around the communities surrounding Cedar Cliff. In those days, school lasted only 5 months of the year, starting on the first Monday of August and ending the week before Christmas. She taught at Liberty between Cove Creek and White Oak at the age of 18, then at Riverside, next Rush Fork, and later on Hurricane. She recalls the Rush Fork days.
Years ago, I taught school at Rush Fork, and I stayed with Mr. and Miss Glenn Palmer. They came and wanted me to teach over there because their 2 oldest children, Riley and Emily, were going to school. Well, Emily wasn't quite old enough, but Riley was. And she says, we want you to stay with us and take the children to school. But we walk up that road, and between the 2 little children, leading Emily on one side and Riley on the other. And we'd talk about the mountains and the trees and the skies and the flowers. They were interested in everything that was going on. And now the place where the school stood, it looked so little. I taught the last year there in a little log schoolhouse, and then I taught the first year in the new building. They built a little new wood building, and it was in that building that those children and I saw our first airplane. We heard this roaring noise, and someone said, what is that? What's that? Well, I said, let's go see. So we all went out the door, and we looked back toward the south, and an airplane was flying right along the horizon, just above the mountains. And that was a big thrill for us.
Another lifelong resident we talked with, who lives just across the mountain from where Walina was raised, was Senator Joe Palmer.
I remember when we saw the first big yellow butterfly in the spring of the year, we would go barefooted. And then it was also the time we would drive some of our cattle up the mountain to Gillett Gap at the base of Cedar Cliff and on to Wilson Cove. I guess you might say that young boys barefooted, about 12 years old, would get a good case of spring fever on what seemed like a long, hard trip. I have very vivid memories of the spring house when we got back home and the food that would be on the table. talking about driving cattle to the pasture, one thing we didn't have to drive was the Angora goats. When it got hot in the spring of the year, they would find a hole in the fence and be gone. They had a tendency to seek the highest mountain around, and that was Cedar Cliff, because it was cooler up there and they were more at home. These goats, especially the billies, had long horns, some about 3 feet. I was always amazed how they could run at top speed between trees with their heads sideways and jump from one cliff to another.
Down in the heart of Riverside, tucked between a river and mountain, we met the head of the Ferguson clan, Mr. Millard Ferguson, aged 84, and his delightful wife, Daisy. Their house was a nostalgic setting for a very interesting interview. This house, with a section built before the Civil War, is today the oldest home in the area and one of the oldest in the entire county.
The house was built sometime before the Civil War, and it's built out of the framing was 4x4s, and the logs, and under there is locust logs, huge logs, and they're mortised in, and locust pegs drove in, board holes, locust pegs drove in, and my grandfather had a shop, and he made the nails. They're sort of like an orange spike. That's the way it was put together. In time of the Civil War, they hid their meat and under a cliff up close to the Cedar Cliff, and my father would take the horses. He was 10 years old. He'd take the horses away up in under the Cedar Cliff and hide them when the renegades was a-coming on.
Millard discussed everything from rattlesnakes to mountain goats. Millard has never seen any rattlesnakes in the cove on his side of Cedar Cliff Mountain, which is quite amazing since rattlesnakes are generally found throughout the mountains.
Well, John, we never have had rattlesnakes in the cove, and got black snakes, plenty of them, and they claim they'll kill the rattlesnakes. The black snake will. And that's why we've not got them, I reckon.
Goats were another interesting topic.
Well, we used to have goats on the mountain, Cedar Cliff, about 30 or 40, and they were white, big, long, woolly goats, and they was pretty in the wintertime. Little goats were jumping all over the rocks.
Daisy, a former one-room school teacher, housewife, church, and civic leader, was delighted to show and tell us a little about a few of her homemade quilts.
Well, I pieced those quilts in the wintertime when you couldn't get out and do anything else. And I pieced them out of just scraps that had accumulated. Back when I made those quilts, we did all our own clothing making. I made my own dresses and aprons and whatever else that we needed about the home, and the scraps accumulated, and I pieced the quilts from the scraps, and then I quilted them here in the home. I had old-fashioned quilting frames, and I swung the frames to the hooks in the overhead ceiling, and quilted upstairs in the home, and just at my leisure, I quilted.
Well, now out of all the quilts that you have made, did Millard ever get one?
Well, once when I finished a quilt, he came through the room and I threw it over him. And I said, "There's your quilt now." And that's the only one that I ever specified as being his individual quilt.
That's the quilt right there in the picture, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's the,
Well, I made a mistake when I did that, because since that time, I have been offered fancy money for the quilt. And I would have sold it, but no, it belonged to him and he wasn't going to sell it for any price.
But I am still the mountain. At first I feared this new creature upon my slopes, but no longer, for he is also a part of nature.
Man's kinship, as measured by the mountain's clock, is but a single tick within its mechanism. Yet, within a short time, have come many people who have contributed much toward the progress of civilization. It is only fitting that this land be preserved in their memory.